Hello, and welcome to part 2 of creating data-driven tools in the metaverse. In this video, we'll take what we learned in part 1 and create an actual experience for people to use within Cryptovoxels. So for this tutorial, we will be working with the project called POAP, which stands for Proof of Attendance Protocol. And what it is it's a series of free NFTs that people can redeem by attending real events or in the metaverse. The example is going to be relatively simple. We're just going to show the user their most recently collected POAPs as soon as they enter our parcel. And although that's not going to be the most interesting application in the world, it will give you the tools that you need to apply the same framework and line of thinking to any problem that you can think of really relating to data on the blockchain. Even though blockchain data is public and accessible, it's unfortunately not that easy to do analysis on it and extract specific information out of it. And the reason for that is that a blockchain like Ethereum provides a complete history of transactions and events, but it doesn't give you a framework to actually extract the information you need from it. So if we take the analogy, let's say, of a phone book, if you were given a phone book that was basically ordered based on when people moved into a town or were born, and I asked you to find the phone number for a specific individual, you would have a really hard time figuring out where that information actually lives in the phone book. But if you had better tools to actually parse through that data, like for example, if your phone book is ordered in alphabetical order, you can look up the last name of the person and have a really good framework to find that person. And taking the idea one step further, if you have a phone book that's really smart, you can just ask, hey, phone book, give me the phone number for this person, and it will just spit out the information you need. So essentially, when we're working with raw blockchain data, we're given a version of that phone book that is quote unquote not indexed, meaning we don't have any way of extracting the information we need out of it. And unfortunately, this is not an easy problem for people to solve. So if you want to run your own application or run some kind of analysis, let's say you're wanting to create an analysis on a smart contract that lives on Ethereum. So what you need to do is you need to run your own Ethereum node, which has all historical transactions for Ethereum. And then you need to come up with a different layer, which is able to index that data in a way that you can extract the meaningful information out of that. And even if you were able to solve the insanely difficult challenge, you'd still run into the issue that you would likely be relying on some kind of centralized infrastructure and have centralized points of failure where your decentralized application or analysis could easily fail and stop working. So how do we actually solve the problem in a sustainable way? Well, lucky for us, there's a decentralized blockchain protocol that actually solves this problem for us, and it's called the Graph. As of recording this video, there are two ways for us to interact with the Graph protocol. So the first way is we can use their hosted service, which is a centralized system that they maintain and develop, which is free for anyone to use and provides public endpoints to any smart contract that people configure. So any user can decide that a smart contract has interesting data, and they can use the tools provided by the graph to create what's called a subgraph. And each of these subgraphs basically provides a public API endpoint that we can get data from and use it for things like our Cryptovoxels application. Their decentralized service is already live and functional and working, but in order to keep this tutorial simpler, I'm going to walk through the hosted service. The reason for that is interacting with the decentralized service would feel the exact same way for you as a developer, but it would require you to create your own API key and add funds to that API key. And it's extremely cheap to query the data from the graph. It is certainly much, much cheaper than it would cost you to create your own infrastructure to get to this data. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to stick to the hosted service, which has the data we need, and you will not need to create an API key to follow along. So now scrolling through their website, you can see that we have a lot of different applications that we could interact with and extract data out of. I'm actually going to go down here to the community subgraph section, and I'm going to search for POAP. And in here, I already know the one we need. So I'm just going to pick the official subgraph that was developed by the POAP team. And we're going to stick to this one. All subgraphs leverage a framework called GraphQL, which is, in my opinion, a lot better than a normal API. So the way a normal API works is you can go to a specific URL, and instead of seeing, a page like Facebook or YouTube, you essentially only get data back for your response. But the data you get is very specifically designed by the developer, and it doesn't allow a user like us to actually specify the data we want to get out of the API. And what happens is we find ourselves retrieving a lot of information that is redundant to what we're doing. So like we might need one smaller piece of information and we're returning a ton of information. And the second aspect is that we're really limited in the analysis that we can do to what that developer of the API has thought of in advance. So with GraphQL, there's like a schema, which is what we see here on the right. And out of this schema, we can click on any of these items and there's going to be different things that we can specifically ask for from the schema rather than being limited to a very specific API endpoint. Now, I realize that's a lot of information to take in and it's hard to conceptualize how you would actually do this. So let's actually just walk through it. So over here, we have an example queries on the left. So I'm actually going to just take out this entire top part because what we need is really this accounts information. So we want to use the accounts endpoint to find information about our private wallet and get a list of tokens that we own out of this. So now if I click on this purple play button over here, I can execute the query that we have on the left side and I can see what the results of that request would look like. So now we have results here, but what we're interested in is data for our specific address. So now because this data is already indexed by the graph, I can jump in here and I can change this parameter of like first 5, which only shows us the first 5 accounts created. I can actually change this to say where, and then I'm going to say ID is my wallet. So when I run this now, it's going to give me the data for my account right here. And I realize that as you're watching this, you're probably thinking to yourself, I have no idea what you just did or how I could apply this to any other subgraph or problem. So let's actually quickly review how you can actually build your own queries in a much more intuitive way than what I just did. So if we go up here, we're going to have a URL for queries. So I'm just going to copy and paste this. And I'm going to go to this website and all links are going to be in the description. So refer to that for all the links I'm using. And I'm also going to have a code that you can reference. But now on this page, I can enter that endpoint URL and I can go to it. And from this page, I can actually build my query in a really interactive and easy way. So we're looking for the accounts endpoint. So I'm going to click on accounts. Then I'm going to choose ID, tokens owned, and then I'm also going to, and notice how as I click these buttons, it's actually building the query for us right here. And when I open tokens, it's going to add a new tokens, but you can see that it needs us to select what we want out of this piece of the schema. So in here, I'm going to say, okay, I want the ID for each token. And let's say, sure, why not the created. And going back up here, so you can see that there's kind of this nested structure happening. So within accounts, we actually have these purple parameters that we can change. So if I click on where, again, it's going to add this like where clause in here. And I can select where ID. And then in here, I can just enter my wallet address. And then when I run this query, it's going to give us the exact same response as we saw on the other website. So just for comparison, you can see that it's the exact same response here. So now we have successfully built a query that returns the tokens that the wallet address owns. So as the next step, we're going to perform the same query request from Cryptovoxels. And once it's in Cryptovoxels, we can essentially use the player's wallet information to change this string of text to instead use the wallet address of the person visiting and collect data for that person. So the way we're going to approach this is I'm going to provide you with a code template that you can use and apply to data for any subgraph. So right here is the GitHub repository for this tutorial. And again, the link will be in the description. And I recommend that you go to it and you just copy and paste the template I created. So it's going to be right under part 2. You're going to just click on this button, which is going to copy the code. And then we're going to jump into Cryptovoxels. And kind of like we did in part 1, I'm going to create a new button here. And basically every time we click on this button, we're going to make a new request. So I'm going to go to script and expand. And then I'm going to go to shortcut snippets and I'm going to select the one that says on click. So then we perform an action every time we click on the button. So I'm going to take the comment that says your code here and I'm going to replace it with our code. And then in here, now we have 2 points for you to replace with basically any query from the graph that you would want. So the first one up here is going to be the URL of the endpoint. So I'm going to go back in here and it's going to be the same one that we put into this web application before. So I'm going to copy that, copy and paste that in there. And then the second one is the query we want to perform on that endpoint. So I'm going to take this your query here and I'm going to replace it with the query we came up with. So I'm going to throw that in there. And then hopefully after I save this, and there's a green button, there we go, or green toggle. Now every time I click on this button, we should see a new data element appear. So let's see if it works. Yes, so every time I click on this, now there's a new data element. And this is the equivalent basically of what we were doing before. Every time we click on this, it's creating a new request and then a new one. Same here, when we click on it, it's going to create a new request. Same exact thing is happening now, but in Cryptovoxels. So we can open this up and we can go to the data element. And then we have accounts, which is the element of the schema we selected. And then there's the ID of the wallet. So 0 is like the first element of the request. And then in there, we have the ID of the wallet. And then we have 3 tokens. So I can open this up and then I have the ID of each of the tokens for this wallet. So now that we're able to successfully make GraphQL requests to the graph, let's just quickly talk about how we can extract the data that we want to display. So we have this kind of like nested JSON output, which might seem intimidating, but it's actually pretty nice in this context for us to extract that data. So I'm going to expand this and I'm going to make a new line here. And I'm going to say console.log like before. And I'm going to go result, which is what we're showing now. And instead of just showing the result, I'm going to keep drilling down into the information we need. So we really want to get down to this first number, let's say. So I'm going to say result.data, because that's our first basically nested element. And then I'm going to say .accounts. And now we have a list of values, and it's only one value here, but you can see that it says 0. So in this case, I'm going to have to say square bracket 0, and then we can keep drilling down. And I really want the tokens, so I don't want the ID here. I mean, I could, but I want the tokens field, so I'm going to say .tokens. And then I'm going to get the first element of this list. So in this case, we do have 3 elements in the list, and I want the first one. And then I'm going to say .id. And hopefully this should just return this number 261232 that we're interested in. So let's see what happens now. So let's wait for it to be green. It is. So now when I click on this button, so now, yeah, every time I click on this button, you can see that that number also appears. Next, we want to make sure that the query we're performing is not pointing to this address I specified here, but rather the address of the person who's currently visiting the parcel. So in order to do that, I'm going to add this kind of backtick, because that's how we're opening this query. You can see we're opening it there. So we have to close the quote, I guess. And then we're going to do plus e.player.wallet. And then we're going to do plus and then another backtick. And hopefully this should give us the exact same result, but now it's actually reading in the wallet address, and now it's green. So I should be able to click this button, and there we go. So we get the exact same result. Obviously it's not as intuitive, like not seeing it change, but I promise you it's now reading in the wallet address that I'm currently logged into Cryptovoxels with, and it's using that to perform the request now. So now we've basically talked about how to create GraphQL requests that are from the graph using someone's wallet address from Cryptovoxels. So in order to really give creators the best tools possible, I also want to talk about how you can do a regular API request, because you might have that need probably, especially if you're collecting data from, let's say, OpenSea. You're going to have to do a regular API request. So what I'm going to show you next is we're going to take the ID for this token we found, and we're going to do an API request to the POAP API using this ID. So I just copied the ID, and I'm going to open a new tab here, and I'm going to make an API request through the browser. So I'm going to do api.poap.xyz, and then token, and then the one we want. And you can see that we basically get the equivalent of what we see in Cryptovoxels when we do this stuff. Like this is a JSON response, and we're basically seeing the same kind of response here. And in here, if we look really closely, there's like an image URL. So let's just take a look at this. So if I take this URL and I open a new tab and I put it in, so this now gives us the image that's associated with this POAP. So what we're gonna do next is we're gonna take what we already have, and we're gonna create a new API request using that token to get to this result. And then from this result, we're gonna extract this image URL, and we're gonna use it to update an image within Cryptovoxels. So let's go back to the page where I have all the code laid out, and let's go to the section where for the API request. And again, all this is going to be linked in the description if you cannot find it, but look for where it says example API request. Then we're going to copy this code, and we're going to go back into Cryptovoxels. And then here we're going to open up our code, and we're going to go right under the line we wrote earlier. I'm gonna just copy and paste that code from before. And in here, the only thing we need to change for this one is actually the API endpoint. And I kind of mentioned this before, but with an API, you don't actually create a customized query for the data you want. So even though we only want this image URL, we need to make a request that has all of this information. And that's kind of part of the reason for why GraphQL is a better option. But it also, a regular API request in some senses is simpler because we only have to replace the API endpoint. So in here, I'm going to take this URL from before. I'm going to replace that. And you can see that what we really want to do is we want to programmatically take this 261232 token ID. We actually want to programmatically take that instead of like hard coding to this one, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna delete that specific ID, and then I'm just gonna do plus, and then I'm gonna take what we wrote before. So I'm just gonna take this result and I'm gonna plug it in there, and then hopefully we should see a new result with data which gives us the data from this endpoint as well. So let's see if that works. So wait for this to turn green. Now it is. Let me scroll down here. So, oh, there we go. So yeah, we can see that now we're getting this like event information for our token. So token ID 261232. Even though I didn't specify that number, we took it from the previous result. So in here we have event, and we can extract the image URL. So in order to get to that URL, so let's open our code back up. And instead of saying console.log.data, we're going to modify to say data.event, kind of like we did before. And then dot image URL. And hopefully instead of getting this response, we should just get the URL of the image in our response. Let's see if this works. It's been a little bit buggy. Give it a second. There we go. So if I click on this, there we go. So it just gives me the same response as before. So you can see I clicked it 5 times, so it just pulled that 5 times, and I can click on it and it gives us the image. So all we really have left to do now is we just need to create an image element within Cryptovoxels that we update with this link. So let's open the build menu. Let's add an image element in here. I'm just gonna call this, or give it a feature ID. So let's say POAP image. You can name this whatever you want. Just be mindful of what you name it. And then I can go in my button here, and I can go to the shortcut snippets, and I'm gonna do feature get by ID, which is gonna create a new. So I added it here at the bottom. So now we have this new line that says let element equals parcel dot get feature by ID. So I'm gonna say my ID is POAP image, and then I'm gonna move this to the top of the script. And then, so now we have a new element within our script called element. And I'm gonna go down here, and I basically want to change the URL of that image to this result that we found up here. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to say element.set, and actually I'm going to reference my own code. So yeah, element.set, and then should be URL, and then you should just be able to take the URL we found that we're printing out and add it in there. And let's see if this works. Not actually entirely sure. Let's see. So every time I click on this button, let's see, it's gonna take a sec. There we go. It actually worked. Nice. So as a last step, one easy thing that we can do is the button is great for testing purposes, but we really don't want the player to even have to do that. So instead of doing that with the button, I'm gonna look at another shortcut snippet that's play or enter. So this is basically instead of like triggering the event when the button is clicked, we're gonna trigger the event whenever the player visits the parcel. So I'm just gonna replace that piece, and I'm just gonna delete this from the bottom. And so now let's say I'm sorry about the URL being, or the image being a bit buggy. So I'm gonna remove this, and now it's like an empty image again. So I'm gonna leave the parcel, and when I come back, hopefully it should update to the image. Let's see. There we go. So it updated to the image. Awesome. So that's the end of this tutorial. Hopefully this was helpful. We learned how to make GraphQL queries to the graph, and then how to pass the results from those queries into a different API and update an image within Cryptovoxels. There's a lot more you could do, and I can do follow-up tutorials that dive deeper into other topics. But one really useful reference is the wiki for Cryptovoxels. There's a lot in here. I think this is really great, actually. It's a really good wiki. And you can find scripting documentation that walks you through things in really a lot of detail, and you can find a lot of code snippets that might be useful to you in here. And I think one really helpful part of the wiki is the scripting examples. So you can find all sorts of examples in here. So like you can create URLs that change on a timer, for example. And that's actually one aspect that we could have done here is rather than just showing one POAP, we could figure out how many the user has and then update a number of images based on how many the user has. So really you can do whatever you can think of. You should be able to apply all the code we used here to really any problem, because on the graph, you can have a subgraph for any smart contract. So you should be able to apply this to any blockchain related problem. And you should be able to also take all of this code and knowledge and apply the same structure to doing similar things within Decentraland and I'm sure other metaverses. So hopefully this was helpful, and reach out to me on Twitter is probably the best place to reach out to me if you run into any issues, and really looking forward to what people build, hopefully.